Okay, so far we have worked a lot with JavaScript objects and arrays and so on. And we have become very familiar, for example, to the syntax of getting that data that looks like this, for example, with a name and then which is a string, Christian, and then Christian has an age which is equal to 30, and then we have another person here called Carl, which has a name of Carl, which has and Carl has an age of 27, and so on. And we have been working with these objects and arrays to basically print out different type of data and work with different type of data that we're interested in. And this way of writing data has basically become a standardized data format that we basically work with data even when we don't write JavaScript. And what this data format is called is JSON, and this stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So basically a way of defining objects or entities of data by using a JavaScript objects. So a JavaScript object looks like this. It has like this basically. It has a key and it has a value and a key and a value. And the key is always written without any string notation or anything, and the value is well dependent on which type of data type it is you write. It's either here we have a string and here we have a number. It can also be a boolean or whatever we want to set our data as. With JSON it looks a little bit different. With JSON we always have to write our key as within quotations. So if a JavaScript object would look like this, its equivalent in JSON would look like this. And here we can see that it's just the actual key that we have to put in string notated format, and not actual value, because the data type of the value is represented by how it's basically typed out. So this is how that equivalent JavaScript object would look in JSON. And we can actually mimic this by assigning this to a variable, and we could call this JSON string. And then we can just basically wrap this entire object in single quotation marks like this. And now this is valid JSON, basically a valid string of JSON showing a JSON object. And this we could also then basically make this equivalent object as JSON object as a JavaScript object by we can just copy this. And I will create under here a new variable or constant, which I will just call JS, and then I will just set this equal to this object here, and I will remove the quotation marks from string. So here we have the same object represented first in JSON and then as a JavaScript object. And when working with JSON and JavaScript together, it's very easy to convert one into another. And often we can, for example, receive JSON as pure string data, as JSON data, and then we need to be able to work with it in our JavaScript program we need to convert it into a JavaScript object. And the way we would do this is that we use a method called parse on the JSON JavaScript object, which is an object entity of JavaScript. So I'll demonstrate this by just creating a new constant here that I will call parsed. And then I will set this equal to JSON in capitals dot parse, and then whatever I want to parse. And the JSON I want to parse is this JSON string. And what this parsed constant now becomes is basically this the same as this JavaScript object. So since it'll turn this JSON string here into its equivalent in as a JavaScript object. So if I would console.logout this parsed constant here, Oh, say that we have forgotten to take up the browser, but here's the browser. This parsed constant here, and I would save this, and I would refresh. We can see that, well, it should be up here somewhere. Here we can see it. That we get it. We get this the JSON string that was in basically string format before. We now, after we parsed it as JSON, we managed to turn it into an actual JavaScript object here. And to show you guys that it's actually this object that we see here, I will write before here, this is a parsed string. And then I would save that again, and I would refresh this. And we can see that up here, this is a parsed string. And then we see this new JSON object here. And in the same way that we might want to turn raw JSON data into JavaScript, we also often, when we send data to a server, need to convert this JavaScript object that we send into pure JSON. And the way we do that is quite similar. And again, we will go on to use this JSON object here. And we will, instead of using the parse method, we will use a method called stringify, which purpose is basically to take a JavaScript object and turn it into pure JSON. So I will create a new constant here that I will call stringified. And then I will invoke here the JSON object. And then I will call the stringify method. And then I just will pass here as an argument basically the object that I want to turn into pure JSON, which is this JS constant here, which contains this JavaScript object here. And if I save this, I need to console.log it to put it out on the screen. Console.log, and then I will say this was an object before, and then I will print out the JS variable here, or not the JS variable, the stringified variable or constant. And then when I refresh this, we can see that we get first we see here that this is a parsed string. Is this when we parsed the JSON string here to a JavaScript object, and assigned it to the parsed variable. We console logged out that first, and we can see that this is a real object that we can interact with. So on, we can see that it contains all of these methods and stuff. And then when we console log out, this was an object before, and then log out this stringified variable here, which was the JS JavaScript object here that we then stringified to basically turn into raw JSON. We can see that this was an object before, and then we see that this is just string data now. This is nothing we can print, click on and look at its properties or anything. So this has now become pure JSON and would be ready to be sent to a web server to be stored in a database, for example. And that is basically what JSON is, how it differs from JavaScript, and how we work with it dependent on if we receive raw JSON or if we need to send JSON and need to basically create JSON from an existing JavaScript object.